I am Kiara, 35 years old, and a self-made luxury real estate stager and interior designer in Atlanta. At an upscale family dinner in a private dining room that I was paying for, my younger sister Chloe clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon. She leaned heavily against her newlywed husband Liam, flashing a smug, entitled smile that I had despised since childhood. She cleared her throat and loudly announced to the table that Mom and Dad had promised they could move into my fully paid-off Buckhead brownstone. She looked me dead in the eye and said it was finally time for me to share my blessings with the family. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply sipped my sparkling water, set the glass down delicately on the pristine white tablecloth, and replied, "That is awkward. I sold the house last Friday to a beautiful couple." The entire table froze in absolute silence. My mother, Valerie, turned completely ashen, her heavy silver fork clattering loudly against her fine china plate as the reality of my words struck her. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. To understand how we reached that explosive moment of truth, you have to rewind 6 months. My life at that time was a carefully constructed masterpiece of hard work, discipline, and ironclad boundaries. Building a luxury real estate staging firm from the ground up in a competitive market like Atlanta is not for the faint of heart. When I first started out in my late 20s, I had nothing but a leased cargo van, a small storage unit full of discount furniture, and a relentless drive to succeed. I spent my days hauling heavy sofas up narrow staircases, negotiating contracts with ruthless real estate developers, and studying the psychology of buyers. I learned very quickly that in the business of luxury aesthetics, you cannot afford to be soft. I built a reputation for transforming empty, echoing mansions into warm, inviting homes that sold for millions above asking price. My business was my lifeblood. I poured every ounce of my energy into securing high net worth clients, expanding my inventory warehouse, and eventually hiring a dedicated team to handle the heavy lifting. I became a self-made woman in every sense of the word, dealing in ironclad contracts, flawless aesthetics, and a calm, observant demeanor that protected my peace. But no matter how much success I achieved in the professional world, stepping into my parents' house always felt like walking into a psychological war zone. In our family dynamic, I was assigned the role of the concrete mule. I was expected to bear the weight, carry the financial burdens, and endure the emotional neglect without a single complaint. My younger sister Chloe, on the other hand, was the glass show pony. At 28 years old, she was pampered, chronically unemployed, and deeply entitled. Our parents, Valerie and Desmond, were incredibly image-obsessed. They cared more about respectability politics and how our family appeared to their church friends than they cared about actual character. They shielded Chloe from the real world, treating her like a fragile porcelain doll while treating me like an ATM machine. The ultimate symbol of my independence and my sweat equity was my brownstone. It was a historic property in a highly coveted Atlanta neighborhood. When I bought it, it was completely dilapidated. The roof leaked, the foundation was cracked, and the yard was an overgrown jungle of weeds and discarded debris. My parents had visited the property exactly once when I purchased it. My father, Desmond, had stood on the rotting front porch, shaken his head in disgust, and told me I was throwing my money into a garbage pit. My mother, Valerie, had covered her nose, complained about the dust, and called my business ambitions a cute little hobby that would eventually bankrupt me. They refused to help me with a single dime or a single hour of labor. I did not let their negativity stop me. For 3 years, I poured my blood, sweat, and capital into that house. I spent my weekends sanding down the original heart pine floors until my hands bled. I sourced antique fixtures to restore the fireplaces to their former glory. I acted as my own general contractor, managing electricians and plumbers to ensure every wire and pipe was brought up to code. When it was finished, it was not just a house. It was a multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece. It was my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of everything I had overcome. The living room featured soaring ceilings with custom lighting. The kitchen was a chef's dream of marble and brass, and the master suite was a peaceful retreat where I could finally rest after exhausting days. Naturally, once the brownstone was transformed into a magazine-worthy estate, my parents suddenly changed their tune. They bragged to their friends about their daughter's beautiful home, conveniently omitting the fact that they had called it a garbage pit just years prior. But the contrast in how they treated my massive achievements versus Chloe's minor existence was always glaring. I remember closing a massive staging contract for a luxury high-rise development downtown. I worked 80-hour weeks for a month straight to secure it. When I shared the news at a Sunday dinner, my mother offered a brief nod before immediately changing the subject to Chloe. Chloe had just completed a 2-week online course in social media management. My parents threw her a massive celebration, bought her a designer handbag, and praised her work ethic to anyone who would listen. Chloe never actually utilized that certificate. She quit her first job after 3 days because her manager asked her to arrive on time. Valerie and Desmond immediately paid her rent, covered her car note, and told her that she was too special to be mistreated by corporate America. I learned to lock my resentment away behind a calm exterior, realizing that my parents' validation was a rigged game I would never win. The toxic family dynamic shifted from manageable to entirely unbearable with the introduction of Liam. Liam was 30 years old, white, and possessed an ego that completely eclipsed his actual abilities. He was Chloe's new husband and a self-proclaimed crypto entrepreneur. In reality, he was a failed tech bro whose apps never launched, whose digital currency investments had crashed, and whose credit cards were routinely maxed out. He wore cheap suits that he tried to pass off as bespoke, and he spoke entirely in meaningless corporate jargon about synergy, blockchain disruption, and leveraging assets. To anyone with a modicum of business sense, Liam was a walking red flag. But to Valerie and Desmond, Liam was the ultimate prize. My parents suffered from a bizarre, deeply ingrained inferiority complex. They viewed Liam's proximity to perceived whiteness and his empty promises of future wealth as a badge of honor for the family. They fawned over him in a way that made my stomach turn. They laughed at his terrible jokes, praised his non-existent business acumen, and treated him with a reverence they had never once shown me. Desmond would sit on the patio with Liam smoking cigars and listening to Liam talk about how he was going to revolutionize the financial sector, completely ignoring the fact that Liam was driving a leased car he could barely afford. The tension culminated during a dinner my parents arranged shortly after Chloe and Liam returned from a weekend getaway that my parents had undoubtedly financed. We met at a high-end steakhouse in Midtown. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken agendas. Valerie spent the first 20 minutes of the meal buttering me up, complimenting my outfit, and asking superficial questions about my staging business. I knew immediately that a trap was being set. Desmond raised his glass of bourbon, making a grand performative toast to family unity and the importance of supporting one another's dreams. Then Liam cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He started talking about his newest venture, some convoluted digital consulting agency that existed only in his mind. He explained that in order to secure elite investors, he needed to project an image of absolute success. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, explaining that they had just signed a lease on an expensive luxury apartment to serve as their home and headquarters. The catch, of course, was that the apartment was completely empty and they had no money to furnish it. Valerie turned to me with a bright, demanding smile. She told me that since I had an entire warehouse full of high-end staging furniture, it was my duty to help my sister and my new brother-in-law. They were not asking to borrow a couch. They ambushed me with a demand. They wanted me to provide $30,000 worth of free interior design services and luxury furniture for Liam and Chloe's rented apartment. Valerie insisted that it was the least I could do to make Liam feel welcome in our family, and to support Black love, completely ignoring the irony of her statement. Desmond chimed in, stating that since my business was doing so well, transferring some inventory to my sister would not hurt my bottom line. I sat there looking at the four of them. Chloe looked expectant and greedy. Liam looked incredibly smug, sipping his wine, as if my compliance was already a guaranteed transaction. Valerie and Desmond looked at me with the heavy, oppressive expectation of obedience. They genuinely believed that they could volunteer my hard-earned assets to fund the illusion of Liam's success. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I placed my napkin on the table, looked directly at Liam, and delivered a surgical flat refusal. I said no. I will not be doing that. My staging inventory is for paying clients and contracted real estate developments. I am not outfitting a rental apartment for free. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe's jaw dropped. Liam scoffed, muttering something under his breath about me not understanding the concept of familial investment. Valerie immediately exploded. Her pleasant demeanor vanished, replaced by an intense, simmering ire. She leaned across the table and accused me of being selfish, bitter, and jealous of Chloe's happiness. She loudly proclaimed that I cared more about my ridiculous furniture than I cared about my own flesh and blood. Desmond slammed his hand on the table, ordering me to show respect, and demanding that I write off the furniture as a business expense to help my sister. I refused to participate in their emotional theater. I signaled the waiter quietly paid for my portion of the meal and stood up. I told them that my business is not a charity for able-bodied adults who refuse to work. I wished them luck with the apartment, turned on my heel, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to simmer in their rage. That firm boundary was the catalyst for everything that followed, setting the stage for an escalation of entitlement and betrayal that would force me to sever my family ties once and for all. The silence between my family and me lasted exactly 3 weeks. I knew the peace was temporary. In my family, silence was never an apology or a moment of reflection. It was simply the reloading period between attacks. They needed me too much to let me walk away entirely. The illusion of their lifestyle required funding, and they had long ago decided I was the designated bank. The summons came on a Tuesday afternoon via a group text from my mother, Valerie. The message was brief and carried the heavy tone of a royal decree. She stated that there was a mandatory family meeting at their house that evening to discuss Chloe and Liam's upcoming wedding. She added that my attendance was required because it involved family legacy and community standing. I read the message from my office, finished my espresso, and decided to go. I did not go because I felt obligated. I went because in business and in warfare, it is always best to look your opponent in the eye and see exactly what kind of strategy they are bringing to the table. I arrived at my parents' house just after sunset. Their home was a sprawling, overly decorated suburban property that always smelled sharply of lemon polish and vanilla candles. It was a house built entirely for presentation. I walked into the living room and found the stage perfectly set for an ambush. Chloe was sitting on the center of the plush white sofa, surrounded by thick wedding planning binders and fabric swatches. She had a tissue crumpled in her hand, looking exactly like a damsel in distress. Liam was standing near the fireplace, swirling a glass of my father's expensive bourbon, wearing a look of mild irritation. Desmond was pacing the floor with his hands behind his back, projecting the image of a stressed patriarch. Valerie sat in the armchair, her posture rigid, and her face arranged into a mask of maternal concern. I took a seat on the single-accent chair near the doorway. I kept my coat on and placed my handbag on my lap, sending a clear physical signal that I had no intention of staying long. I looked around the room and told them they had exactly 15 minutes of my time before my next client call. Valerie immediately sighed, shaking her head, as if my professional boundaries were a personal insult. She leaned forward and began a highly rehearsed monologue. She talked about how Chloe was the baby of the family, how a wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, and how important it was for our family to present a united, successful front to Liam's relatives and business connections. Desmond chimed in, his voice deep and authoritative. He stated that Liam was bringing a lot of potential wealth into the family with his digital ventures, and it was our duty to ensure his wedding reflected his future status. I listened to them spin this ridiculous web of delusion. Liam was unemployed and facing eviction, Yet my parents were speaking about him as if he were a tech billionaire doing us a favor by marrying my sister. Chloe finally spoke up, her voice quivering with practiced emotion. She told me that wedding planning had become incredibly stressful. She said the venue they booked, a luxury botanical garden, required all vendors to be paid in full 60 days before the event. She wiped a dry eye and whispered that they were falling a little short on the budget. Valerie smoothly took over the pitch. She reached over to the coffee table, picked up a thick manila folder, and slid it across the glass surface toward me. She said that since my real estate staging business was thriving, they had decided I was going to sponsor the catering and the floral arrangements. She used the word sponsor as if my sister's wedding was a charity gala. I did not reach for the folder. I looked at the glossy invoice peeking out from the edge. I asked them calmly exactly how short they were on this budget. Liam took a sip of his bourbon and spoke up. He said they needed $80,000. He stated the number with such casual arrogance that for a fraction of a second I thought I had misheard him. He went on to explain that his network of crypto investors expected a certain caliber of hospitality. He had insisted on a menu featuring imported Wagyu beef, a raw seafood bar with premium caviar and vintage champagne. Chloe added that the floral designer was flying in thousands of rare white orchids from Japan to build a custom flower wall for their vows. I sat back in my chair and looked at the four of them. They were completely serious. They had summoned me to this house to demand an $80,000 check to feed caviar to unemployed crypto bros and buy imported flowers for a sister who had never worked a full week in her life. I kept my voice entirely level. I looked directly at Valerie and told her I would not be paying for the catering. I told her I would not be paying for the flowers. I stated that I run a staging firm, not a wedding charity, and I do not finance the lavish lifestyles of adults who cannot afford their own parties. The atmosphere in the living room shattered instantly. The fake smiles vanished. Desmond stopped pacing and glared at me, his chest puffing out as he tried to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He pointed a finger in my direction and ordered me to stop being disrespectful. He said that I had the money sitting in my bank accounts doing nothing, and it was my obligation as an older sister to bless Chloe on her special day. I did not flinch. I replied that my money was not doing nothing. It was working for me, protecting my future and expanding my enterprise. I told him that my finances were none of his business, and his lack of financial planning was not my emergency. That was when Valerie unleashed the psychological warfare. She stood up, her face twisted with a vicious, ugly kind of anger. She crossed her arms and looked down at me with pure contempt. She told me I was a bitter, jealous woman. She said my refusal had nothing to do with business and everything to do with envy. Her voice grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings as she attacked my personal life. She told the room that I was furious because Chloe had found a good man who loved her, while I was sitting alone in a giant empty house with no husband and no prospects. She called me cold and barren. She said my money would never keep me warm at night, and I was holding on to my wealth because I wanted to punish Chloe for being loved, beautiful, and chosen. Liam smirked, clearly enjoying the character assassination. Chloe hid her face behind her hands, playing the innocent victim of my supposed cruelty. Years ago, a speech like that from my own mother would have devastated me. It would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and tears. I would have felt the desperate urge to defend myself, to prove my worth, to scream that I was not bitter, and perhaps even write the check just to buy her temporary affection. But sitting in that chair, I realized something profound. I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not increase. My palms were not sweating. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, and all I saw was a desperate, financially illiterate enabler projecting her own insecurities onto her successful daughter. Her words were just empty noise. The psychological manipulation had completely lost its power over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my relationship status or my happiness. I did not explain that I chose my peace over chaotic relationships. I simply let her finish her tirade. I let the ugly silence stretch across the room for several long, uncomfortable seconds. I watched as her chest heaved from the exertion of her yelling, and I watched the realization dawn in her eyes that her attack had not broken me. I picked up my handbag and stood up gracefully. I smoothed out the front of my tailored skirt. I looked at Chloe and Liam, who were staring at me in stunned silence. I smiled a small, polite, and entirely detached smile. "Good luck with the caterer," I said. I turned my back on my parents, walked out of the living room, and let myself out the front door. I walked down their pristine driveway to my car, the cool evening air feeling incredibly refreshing. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I had set my boundary in stone, and I knew exactly what they would do next because desperate people always double down on their own destruction. I knew exactly what my father would do the moment my taillights faded down his manicured street. Desmond was a man ruled entirely by the fragile, terrifying fear of public embarrassment. He could not stomach the idea of calling the botanical garden to cancel the imported orchids or downgrade the Wagyu beef. More importantly, he could not bear the thought of looking Liam in the eye and admitting he did not have the liquid capital to fund the extravagant lifestyle they had all been pretending was normal. So instead of doing the financially responsible thing and scaling back the wedding, my father walked straight into a trap of his own making. I found out through the family grapevine that Desmond had taken out a predatory high-interest personal loan to cover the $80,000 shortfall. He had leveraged his retirement safety net, signing his name on the dotted line of a loan with an interest rate so steep it practically guaranteed his eventual financial ruin. He did this just to save face with Liam's family, a group of people he desperately wanted to impress. When the wedding day finally arrived 2 months later, I decided to attend. I did not go to celebrate. I went because refusing to show up would have given Valerie the satisfaction of calling me a coward. I refused to hide. I wore a tailored, understated charcoal silk suit that spoke of quiet wealth, a sharp contrast to the absolute circus I was about to walk into. The wedding was an ostentatious disaster of overspending. It was a masterclass in trying too hard. The moment I stepped onto the grounds of the luxury botanical garden, the scent of the thousands of rare white imported Japanese orchids was suffocating. They were woven into a massive, towering floral arch that looked less like a romantic backdrop and more like a desperate cry for validation. The reception hall was draped in heavy white silk, dripping with crystal chandeliers that cast a harsh glare over the gaudy ice sculptures stationed by the raw seafood bar. I took my assigned seat at a table placed strategically near the back of the room. I watched the spectacle unfold with cold, calculated detachment. Liam's family had flown in, and they were exactly what I expected. Despite my parents treating them like visiting royalty, Liam's relatives were not wealthy. They were loud, unpolished opportunists who were thrilled to be drinking top-shelf vintage champagne on a black man's dime. They swarmed the caviar station, laughing loudly and slapping my father on the back, thanking him for the free luxury vacation. Desmond smiled so hard his face looked strained, sweating through his rented tuxedo as he tried to keep up the charade of the magnanimous, deep-pocketed patriarch. Chloe, of course, was reveling in her delusion. She floated around the room in a custom designer gown that cost more than a reliable car, clutching Liam's arm and posing for the roaming videographers. She looked like a princess in a fairy tale that was actively being financed by a high-interest nightmare. Valerie, however, was not content to simply enjoy the party. She had spent the last 2 months weaponizing the extended family against me, spinning a narrative that I was a cruel, stingy villain who had tried to sabotage her youngest daughter's special day. The reception became the perfect battleground for her flying monkeys to do her bidding. The passive-aggressive comments started during the appetizer course. My Aunt Patrice, a woman who had filed for bankruptcy twice and still owed my mother money, slid into the empty chair next to me. She adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, gave me a tight, sympathetic smile, and leaned in close. "It really is a beautiful wedding," Patrice whispered loudly enough for the rest of the table to hear. "Your parents really stepped up to make sure Chloe had her dream day. It is just such a shame you could not find it in your heart to bless your sister. We have to support Black Love Kiara. Even when we are struggling with our own single status, we cannot let bitterness stop us from lifting up the family." The phrase was something Valerie loved to weaponize. In their twisted logic, supporting the family meant unquestioning financial servitude to whatever man Chloe brought home, even a mediocre white man with empty pockets who contributed absolutely nothing to our community or our household. I did not grip my fork tighter. I did not break eye contact. I calmly cut a piece of my salad, took a bite, and swallowed before speaking. I support Black love and family unity just fine, Aunt Patrice, I replied, my voice carrying a polite but lethal chill. What I do not support is financial illiteracy and enabling grown adults who refuse to work. I suggest you focus on your own financial blessings instead of counting mine, especially since your car was repossessed last month. Patrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She stood up abruptly and scurried away, properly neutralized. But Valerie had programmed her soldiers well, and the ambush was far from over. Later in the evening, as the live band started playing and the dance floor filled, my cousin Jamal swaggered over to my table. Jamal was 32, still lived in his mother's basement, and spent his days posting motivational quotes about wealth building on social media. He leaned against my table, holding a glass of Desmond's expensive bourbon. "You know, Kiara," Jamal said, shaking his head with an air of unearned superiority. "A lot of folks are talking. You make all this money staging houses for rich folks, but you are too selfish with your money to help your own blood. You cannot take the money to the grave with you. Generational wealth is about community." I looked at Jamal, taking in his scuffed shoes and the cheap watch he wore to look successful. "Generational wealth is about acquiring and protecting assets." "Jamal," I corrected him, keeping my tone strictly educational. "Funding a party for a crypto bro who does not have a job is not building community, it is burning capital. When you manage to move out of your mother's basement and sign your first mortgage, we can have a conversation about economics. Until then, enjoy the free drinks." Jamal scowled, muttered a bitter insult under his breath, and retreated to the bar. I sat back in my chair, entirely unbothered. I watched my mother glaring at me from across the room. Valerie was seething because her coordinated attacks were failing. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to flee the reception in shame. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of family disapproval. But you cannot crush someone who no longer values your opinion. I was completely immune to their respectability politics and their manipulative guilt trips. As the night wore on, the cracks in the facade became impossible to ignore. I watched Desmond step out onto the stone terrace, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. I could see the panic in his posture, the frantic gestures as he argued with someone on the other end of the line. I knew exactly what was happening. The caterers were likely demanding payment for the overtime hours, and the open bar was rapidly depleting his remaining credit limits. The reality of the debt he had just strapped to his own back was beginning to suffocate him. Liam, meanwhile, was on the dance floor spilling champagne on his rented shoes, completely oblivious to the financial bleeding happening around him. He had secured his luxury experience, insulated from the consequences exactly as he had planned. I stayed just long enough to witness the cake cutting. I watched Chloe and Liam feed each other imported vanilla sponge cake with gold leaf detailing, smiling for the cameras while standing on a foundation of absolute financial quicksand. I knew with absolute certainty that this marriage was doomed, not just because Liam was a fraud, but because you cannot sustain a marriage built on a lie funded by predatory debt. I signaled the waiter, tipped him $100 bill for keeping my sparkling water full all night, and picked up my clutch. I did not say goodbye to Valerie. I did not offer congratulations to the bride and groom. I walked out of the botanical garden, leaving the heavy scent of dying orchids behind me. I climbed into the back of my waiting luxury car service, gave the driver my address, and watched the glowing lights of the venue fade into the darkness. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had maintained my boundaries, protected my assets, and watched my family willingly tie a heavy anchor around their own necks. I knew it was only a matter of time before the high of the wedding faded and the crushing reality of their debt set in. I went home, slept beautifully in my paid-off brownstone, and prepared for the inevitable crisis that would arrive the moment Liam and Chloe ran out of other people's money. The fallout arrived exactly 90 days later. I had been anticipating the collapse since the moment I walked out of that botanical garden, but even I underestimated how rapidly a house of cards crumbles when the wind finally blows. Liam's digital consulting agency and cryptocurrency ventures did not just fail, they evaporated. The market shifted, his phantom investors vanished, and the harsh reality of tangible currency came calling. The luxury high-rise apartment that my parents had desperately tried to force me to furnish required actual liquid cash for rent, not empty promises of future blockchain disruptions. When Liam and Chloe missed their third consecutive payment, the property management company did not care about their wedding photos or their supposed high society connections. The eviction notice was taped to their door, and the sheriff's deputies supervised their forced departure. Meanwhile, Desmond was silently drowning. The first payments on the predatory high-interest loan he took out to fund the caviar and imported orchids were due. He was bleeding capital, frantically trying to shuffle funds between accounts to maintain the illusion of his upper-middle-class stability. The financial pressure cooker was fully sealed, and the explosion was imminent. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was in the main living room of my brownstone, sitting at my marble island, reviewing a staging contract for a newly developed luxury estate in Alpharetta. The house was quiet, smelling of cedar wood and fresh rain. Then my security system chimed. I pulled up the camera feed on my tablet and stared at the screen. Standing on my front porch were Valerie, Desmond, Chloe, and Liam. They were flanked by 4 large, hastily packed suitcases. Chloe was actively weeping into a tissue. Desmond looked aged and exhausted, his shoulders slumped under a wet trench coat. Valerie wore a face of grim determination. Liam stood slightly apart from them, checking his phone, looking completely unbothered by the fact that he was officially homeless. I walked to the front door, disarmed the lock, and pulled it open. I did not step aside to let them in. I stood squarely in the threshold, blocking the entryway. Valerie immediately pushed forward, her voice taking on that familiar commanding tone she used whenever she intended to bulldoze my boundaries. She told me to step aside and let my sister out of the cold. She declared that this was a family emergency and that we needed to have a sit-down immediately. Against my better judgment, but driven by a morbid curiosity to hear exactly what kind of delusion they had cooked up, this time I stepped back. I allowed them into the foyer, but I did not invite them to sit on my custom furniture. I kept them standing on the hardwood floor near the entrance. Valerie did not waste time with apologies or pleasantries. She launched directly into a heavily rehearsed monologue about duty, loyalty, and the responsibilities of success. She looked around my meticulously designed home and stated that God had blessed me with abundance so that I could be a sanctuary for my blood. She leaned heavily into her favorite weapon, declaring that, as a successful Black woman, it was my moral obligation to uplift my family when the world tried to tear them down. She completely glossed over the fact that the world had not torn Liam down. His own sheer incompetence had done that. Then came the demand. Valerie informed me that since my brownstone was so large and I was living here entirely alone, it was only right that I surrender the entire first floor to Chloe and Liam. The first floor of my property was not just empty space. It was a fully finished, separate guest suite with a private entrance and a small kitchenette which I frequently used to host out-of-town developers and high-net-worth clients. Valerie demanded I give it to them rent-free indefinitely until Liam could pivot to his next business venture and get them back on their feet. Chloe sobbed louder, leaning her head on Liam's shoulder. She whined that she was so stressed and that moving into my guest suite was the only way she could recover from the trauma of the eviction. She talked about my home as if it were a public shelter, obligated to accept her. I stared at my mother, marveling at the absolute audacity. Before I could even formulate a response to Valerie's ridiculous proposition, Liam decided to speak. This mediocre man standing in the foyer of a multi-million-dollar property that I owned free and clear looked at me with an expression of supreme arrogance. He adjusted his jacket and told me that the guest suite would be adequate for their living situation, but he had an additional logistical requirement. He stated that his business was currently undergoing a massive restructuring. He needed a secure climate-controlled facility to house his remaining cryptocurrency mining servers and computer hardware. He demanded that I give him a set of keys to my commercial staging warehouse. He explained that my warehouse had the square footage and industrial power grid he needed to rebuild his digital empire. He actually had the nerve to suggest that I could condense my luxury furniture inventory into a smaller section of the building to accommodate his equipment. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect hung in the air. This man who had just bankrupted my sister and forced my father into predatory debt was standing in my house demanding free housing and commandeering my commercial real estate assets to store his worthless computer parts. Desmond nodded along with Liam, looking at me expectantly. He told me to just hand over the warehouse keys so Liam could get back to work. He said it was the least I could do to help fix this situation, as if I had played any part in breaking it. I looked at the four of them. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute silence stretch across the foyer. I made eye contact with each of them, saving Liam for last. I did not yell. I did not curse. I spoke with a voice so cold and quiet it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. I looked directly at Liam. I told him he was not an entrepreneur. I told him he was a financial liability, a grifter who disguised his unemployment with corporate buzzwords. I stated clearly that my commercial warehouse held millions of dollars in curated luxury staging assets, and I would sooner burn it to the ground than let him store a single wire inside my facility. I told him he had zero business acumen, zero capital, and absolutely zero authority to demand anything from me. Liam's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by a flush of red, humiliated anger. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. I turned my gaze to Chloe. I told her that she was a grown woman who had actively chosen to marry a fraud because she was too lazy to build her own life. I stated that her eviction was the natural consequence of her own vanity and refusal to exist in reality. Finally, I looked at Valerie and Desmond. I told them they had enabled a circus-funded a delusion and sacrificed their own retirement to impress a man who could not even keep a roof over his wife's head. I said that they had made their choices, and now they had to live in the wreckage they had financed. I told them my home was a sanctuary built on hard work, not a halfway house for entitled adults. Valerie gasped, her face twisting with rage. She stepped toward me, raising her voice, screaming that I was an unnatural, wicked daughter. She demanded that I show respect to my father and my brother-in-law. Desmond stepped forward, his chest puffed out, trying to leverage his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. He pointed his finger at my face and bellowed that I was going to do exactly what he said because he was the head of this family. I did not flinch. I reached out, opened my heavy, solid oak front door, and pointed into the rainy night. I told them they had exactly 30 seconds to vacate my property before I triggered the silent alarm and had the Atlanta Police Department escort them off the premises for trespassing. I stated that if Desmond pointed his finger in my face again, I would press charges. The absolute finality in my voice stopped Desmond in his tracks. The illusion of his power over me broke right there in the foyer. He looked at my cold, unyielding expression and realized I was completely serious. I was not the terrified little girl he could control with a raised voice. I was a property owner defending my assets. Chloe grabbed her suitcase, sobbing hysterically as she ran out onto the wet porch. Liam quickly followed her, muttering bitter insults under his breath, his fragile ego completely shattered. Valerie grabbed Desmond's arm, pulling him toward the door. She stopped on the threshold, glared at me with pure hatred, and told me I was going to rot in this giant house all alone. I looked at her, smiled calmly, and replied that being alone was a luxury compared to the nightmare of being surrounded by them. I slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt and rearming the security system. I watched through the camera feed as they dragged their suitcases through the rain, cramming themselves into Desmond's car. I walked back to my kitchen island, picked up my staging contract, and went back to work. I had successfully defended my territory, completely unaware that their desperation was about to push them across the line into federal crime. Exactly 2 weeks passed without a single text message, phone call, or passive-aggressive email from my parents. In any healthy family, silence following a massive blowout is a period of reflection and cooling off. In my family, silence was the sound of a shovel digging a trench. I spent those 14 days throwing myself entirely into my staging business. My team had just secured a lucrative contract for a row of luxury townhomes in Midtown, and my days were a blur of vendor meetings, fabric sourcing, and managing warehouse logistics. Coming home to my brownstone every night felt like crossing a drawbridge and pulling it up behind me. The house was quiet, smelling of cedarwood and peace. I honestly thought I had won. I thought that throwing them out and establishing an ironclad boundary had actually kept the monsters outside. I severely underestimated the depths of their desperation. It was a Thursday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee reviewing a quarterly tax projection on my tablet when my phone vibrated loudly against the marble countertop. It was not a text message from a client or an update from my warehouse manager. It was a high-priority automated email notification from the premium property title monitoring service I retained for all my real estate assets. In my line of work, dealing constantly with high-net-worth properties and large transfers of equity title theft is a massive silent epidemic. You pay the steep annual fee to sleep well at night, assuming you will never actually need the service to trigger. I opened the email expecting a routine status update or a policy change notification. Instead, the screen displayed a bright red banner that made my stomach drop instantly. The alert stated that a preliminary home equity line of credit application had been formally initiated against my Buckhead brownstone. The requested draw amount was $250,000. The blood drained from my face, leaving a cold, prickling sensation racing down my neck and spreading into my fingertips. I set my coffee mug down so hard the ceramic clanked sharply against the stone counter. My mind raced through a dozen rational explanations, discarding them as quickly as they appeared. I had zero debt on this property. I owned the brownstone free and clear. I had not applied for any loans, credit lines, or mortgages. For a split second, sheer unadulterated terror gripped my chest. Identity theft was my immediate thought. I assumed some faceless hacker halfway across the world had compromised my social security number, forged my credentials, and was currently trying to siphon the equity out of the biggest financial asset I owned. I quickly logged into the secure online portal to view the raw data pulled by the monitoring agency. The originating bank was a mid-tier regional lender, the exact same bank where my father had held his personal checking and business accounts since I was a little girl. My eyes scanned the preliminary filing documents, searching for a name and IP address, anything that would give me a clue. And then I saw it. The application listed my property address correctly, but the contact phone number attached to the initial inquiry was completely familiar. It was not a hacker from a foreign country. It was an Atlanta area code. It was Desmond's cell phone number. The sheer terror evaporated instantly, replaced by a wave of ice-cold, paralyzing rage. This was not a scam orchestrated by strangers in a dark room. This was an inside job. My own father had initiated a $250,000 loan against the house I bought, renovated, and paid for with my own blood and sweat. He was attempting to leverage my private sanctuary to hand Liam and Chloe a massive pile of unearned cash. The audacity was so astronomical it temporarily defied human logic. They had been kicked out of my house, told no in absolute unmistakable terms, and their response was not to find jobs or scale back their lifestyle. Their response was to cross a hard, unforgivable line into federal mortgage fraud. I stood up from the kitchen island, my legs feeling entirely numb. I began pacing the length of my living room, the reality of their actions crashing down on me in heavy, suffocating waves. Desmond and Valerie were not just entitled parents struggling with boundaries anymore. They were actively attempting to commit a felony against their own flesh and blood. They were willing to forge documents, bypass banking security, and encumber my property with massive predatory debt just to buy Liam a new house and save Chloe from the consequences of her own terrible choices. $250,000 was not a random number. It was a highly calculated amount. It was exactly enough to purchase a comfortable starter home outright in a decent suburb, or more likely, exactly enough to pay off Liam's bankrupt business debts and fund his next delusional crypto venture. They felt entirely entitled to use my home as their personal piggy bank. They assumed I would just take the hit. They assumed that once the money was dispersed, I would be too afraid of sending my own father to federal prison to report the fraud to the authorities. They thought they could hold my conscience hostage. In their twisted minds, they they truly believed they could force me to pay a $250,000 ransom to protect the family name and keep Desmond out of handcuffs. I stopped pacing and looked around my beautiful home. The custom crown molding I had installed, the imported lighting hanging above the dining table, the art I had carefully curated over years of grueling hard work. They wanted to steal it. They wanted to rip the equity right out of my walls and hand it to a mediocre white man who had already brought financial ruin to their doorstep. The specific social dynamics of their betrayal made the rage burn even hotter. They expected the successful, hardworking black woman to sacrifice her livelihood, her credit score, and her primary asset to fund a white man's ego and her sister's refusal to work. It was a complete betrayal of the most sacred trust. You do not steal from your children. You certainly do not commit federal crimes to steal from the only child who actually built a stable, respectable life. I did not cry. Crying is an emotional response to being hurt, and I was far beyond the realm of hurt. Hurt requires a lingering expectation of love, and any love I had left for Desmond and Valerie died the moment I saw my father's phone number on that fraudulent loan application. I was operating in a state of absolute surgical clarity. I needed to know exactly how far they had gotten in the approval process. A preliminary application was one thing, but pushing a $250,000 line of credit through underwriting required strict identity verification, certified tax documents, and legal signatures. I needed to uncover exactly how Desmond was bypassing the initial security checks without triggering immediate alarms at the regional bank. I walked back to my kitchen island, closed my tax projections, and opened a blank browser tab. I was about to dissect my father's fraud piece by piece, and I was going to do it without making a single sound. I did not call the regional bank customer service line. Making a direct inquiry through standard channels would automatically generate a security notification to the applicant on file, which meant Desmond's phone would ping the second I asked a question. I needed to examine the fraudulent application from the inside out, completely undetected. Fortunately, operating at the top tier of the Atlanta real estate market meant my contact list was filled with heavy hitters. I picked up my phone and dialed Tamara. Tamara was a senior title underwriter and one of my closest industry allies. We had navigated dozens of multi-million-dollar closings together, and I trusted her with my life. When she answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her I had a highly sensitive, strictly confidential situation involving my primary residence. I explained that a preliminary home equity line of credit had been opened against my brownstone, and I needed the raw application file pulled from the back-end system without triggering an alert to the originator. Tamara was a consummate professional. She did not gasp or ask unnecessary questions. She simply asked for my parcel identification number and told me to give her 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like a decade. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the blank wall, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in my hallway. I was a woman who dealt in contracts, escrow accounts, and binding agreements every single day. The idea that someone could encumber my largest physical asset without my physical presence felt like a violation of the natural laws of my universe. My tablet chimed with the secure file transfer notification. Tamara had sent an encrypted link. I opened the folder and downloaded the 50-page PDF document containing the loan application. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and began to read. The first few pages were standard bank disclosures, but the signature lines made my blood run cold. Desmond had not even attempted to forge my signature perfectly. He had scrawled a messy approximation of my name, confident that the automated digital verification systems used for preliminary processing would not scrutinize the penmanship until the final underwriting stage. He had listed my correct property address and tax identification numbers, but he had swapped my primary contact email for a newly created burner address and used his own cell phone number for dual-factor authentication. But the most baffling part was the identity verification barrier. To open a line of credit of that magnitude, a bank requires a stringent identity check. Desmond could not just walk into a branch and pretend to be a 35-year-old woman. As I scrolled down to page 18 of the file, I found the exact mechanism he used to bypass the security wall. The sight of the document made me physically nauseous. It was a power of attorney form. I stared at the scanned image of the document, recognizing the official notary stamp from a decade ago. When I was 24 years old, I contracted a severe case of bacterial pneumonia that rapidly escalated into sepsis. I was placed in a medically induced coma and spent 3 weeks in an intensive care unit. Before they intubated me, terrified that I might not wake up, I signed a temporary emergency power of attorney, assigning Desmond the legal right to handle my apartment lease and manage my medical billing. It was the most vulnerable moment of my entire life. When I fully recovered and was discharged from the hospital months later, I officially revoked the document through my attorney. I canceled its legal standing and assumed that dark chapter was permanently closed. But Desmond had kept a physical notarized copy of that original document. He had stored it in his files for over 10 years. Now he had scanned it and uploaded it to the regional bank portal. He was exploiting a known loophole in legacy banking systems. Because my legal name is Kiara D. Washington and his legal name is Desmond K. Washington, the automated preliminary software flagged the shared last name and processed the archaic power of attorney as a valid authorization for a family representative acting on behalf of an incapacitated property owner. The bank system accepted it for the preliminary phase, assuming that the physical verification of the document would be handled at the closing table. He was weaponizing the worst medical trauma of my life to steal my money. The level of sociopathic calculation required to dig out a 10-year-old medical emergency document and use it to commit mortgage fraud against your own daughter was staggering. It proved that Desmond did not view me as a human being. I was an asset. I was a resource to be mined regardless of the emotional or legal cost. I continued scrolling through the file, my rage sharpening into a hyper-focused analytical state. I needed to see exactly where he intended the funds to go. Banks do not simply hand over $250,000 in cash. A home equity line of credit requires a designated disbursement account or a specific wire transfer target. On page 42, I found the disbursement instructions. Desmond had requested a direct wire transfer to a specific escrow account managed by a residential title company located in a gentrifying suburb 30 miles north of Atlanta. I opened a new browser tab, copied the escrow account routing details, and searched the public real estate registry for pending sales handled by that specific title office. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the matching property. It was a new-build 4-bedroom modern farmhouse listed for exactly $400,000. I pulled up the pending sale record and looked at the names of the buyers on the contract, Liam and Chloe. The entire grand scheme snapped into crystal-clear focus. Desmond and Valerie were not just trying to pay off Liam's bankrupt business debts. They were trying to buy Chloe and Liam a brand new house. Liam must have convinced them that getting out of the city and moving into a massive suburban new build was the only way he could adequately recover from his financial collapse. Since Liam and Chloe had evictions on their record and absolutely zero credit, they could not secure a traditional mortgage. So Desmond decided to play the role of the wealthy benefactor. He likely put down his own dwindling cash reserves to cover the initial builder deposit. Now he was planning to use the $250,000 stolen from my brownstone equity to cover the massive down payment and closing costs, effectively buying the house for them outright. I sat back and analyzed the profound psychological warfare embedded in my father's strategy. Desmond knew this was federal mortgage fraud. He was not a stupid man. But he was betting his entire freedom on the dynamics of Black family trauma. He was banking on the unwritten toxic rule that you do not send your parents to jail. His plan was entirely reliant on the element of surprise. He intended to push the loan through the final underwriting stage, secure the wire transfer, and close on the suburban house for Liam and Chloe before I ever noticed the lien on my property title. He assumed that by the time I discovered the $250,000 debt attached to my home, the money would already be gone, fully integrated into Liam and Chloe's new real estate asset. At that point, I would be trapped in the ultimate emotional hostage situation. If I reported the fraudulent loan to the authorities, the bank would immediately launch a federal investigation. The evidence would lead directly to Desmond. My 60-year-old father would face decades in a federal penitentiary for identity theft and wire fraud. Desmond knew I possessed a flawless credit score and a highly profitable business. He assumed that when faced with the choice between paying a $3,000 monthly loan premium or sending my own father to federal prison, I would quietly absorb the financial blow. He believed I would just pay the mortgage on a house I did not even own in order to protect the family name. He thought I would accept my role as the sacrificial lamb so Liam could play house in the suburbs. It was a brilliantly evil plan predicated entirely on the assumption that I still cared about saving him. I looked at the fraudulent signature on the PDF document. I felt a cold, pristine calm wash over my entire body. I closed the file and securely deleted it from my tablet. I did not text Desmond to scream at him. I did not call Valerie to demand an explanation. Engaging with them would only give them the opportunity to panic and attempt to cover their tracks. I needed absolute, flawless execution. I needed to speak with someone who understood the intricate mechanics of banking fraud and who despised Desmond just as much as I did. I needed to formulate a counterstrike that would not just stop the loan, but would trap Desmond in his own snare without requiring me to pull the trigger myself. I grabbed my car keys, put on my sunglasses, and walked out the front door. I was going to pay a visit to Aunt Loretta. I put my phone on airplane mode. I did not need to see Valerie posting passive-aggressive Bible verses on her social media timeline, or Chloe sending complaints to the family group chat about the cramped conditions of her temporary motel room. I needed absolute, impenetrable silence to strategize. I walked out of my brownstone, locked the heavy oak door, and climbed into my car. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic, driving away from the bustling upscale neighborhoods and heading straight toward a quiet, historic district on the south side of the city. I was going to see Aunt Loretta. Loretta was my father's older sister, a woman who possessed a spine made of titanium and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. She was a retired senior bank auditor who had spent 40 years dismantling financial fraud for a living. The family had essentially excommunicated her a decade ago because she had loudly and accurately called out Desmond's financial illiteracy at a Thanksgiving dinner. When Desmond had tried to pitch the family on a ridiculous multi-level marketing scheme, Loretta had pulled out a calculator, exposed the math, and told him he was leading the family into a ditch. Valerie had called her a bitter old woman, and Desmond had banned her from their home. Loretta did not care about respectability politics or maintaining a fake image of family unity. She cared about Ledger's facts and the truth. Because she operated entirely outside of their toxic echo chamber, she was exactly the ally I needed. I parked in front of her immaculate brick ranch house. She opened the front door before I even knocked. She was holding a mug of herbal tea, her sharp eyes immediately scanning my face. She took one look at my rigid posture, the cold expression on my face, and the thick manila folder clutched in my hand. She did not offer a warm, fussing greeting. She simply stepped aside to let me in and pointed toward her dining room. We sat at her heavy oak table. I did not waste time with small talk. I pulled the printed 50-page PDF from the folder and slid it across the polished wood. I told her that Desmond had initiated a $250,000 home equity line of credit against my primary residence. Loretta set her tea down, put on her reading glasses, and opened the file. I sat perfectly still, watching her eyes track across the pages. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp turning of paper and the rhythmic ticking of her grandfather clock. I fully expected her to gasp. I expected her to show shock, outrage, or disbelief at the sheer audacity of her own brother. Instead, she let out a low, cynical chuckle. It was a dark, knowing sound. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the fraudulent signature on page 18. She looked up at me and stated that Desmond had finally crossed the line from everyday stupidity into federal territory. I explained my theory about the escrow account, the suburban new build, and the timeline. Loretta nodded, validating every single suspicion. She broke down the mechanics of the loan process with the precision of a seasoned auditor. She explained that Desmond was currently in a highly vulnerable waiting period. The regional bank had approved the preliminary application based on the automated scan of the archaic power of attorney, but the final underwriting process would take another 7 to 10 days. During that week, the bank would perform a hard pull on the title to ensure there were no new liens, encumbrances, or ownership transfers before they authorized the massive wire transfer to the suburban title company. I leaned forward and told Loretta the core of my dilemma. I told her I could easily call the bank's fraud department right now, hand them this file, and have Desmond arrested by the end of the day. But I explained the psychological trap my parents had set for me. If I made the call, Valerie would spend the rest of her life telling the entire community that I was a vindictive, ruthless daughter who maliciously sent my own father to prison over a simple family misunderstanding. They would spin the narrative to make me the villain, claiming Desmond was just trying to help his struggling daughter Chloe. They wanted me to be the executioner so they could play the martyrs. I told Loretta that I needed a way to drop the guillotine without ever touching the rope. I needed Desmond to trap himself in a snare of his own making. Loretta took off her glasses, folded her hands on the table, and gave me a smile that was entirely predatory. It was the smile of a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a fraudster. She told me that I did not need to call the police. I did not need to report the fraud to anyone. I just needed to let the automated banking system do exactly what it was programmed to do. She outlined a scenario that was beautifully, ruthlessly efficient. It was the ultimate kill shot. Loretta stated that when a bank is in the final stages of underwriting a massive home equity line of credit, their software places a continuous digital monitor on the property title. If the underlying asset suddenly changes legal ownership before the loan clears final approval, the system triggers a catastrophic hard stop. The underwriting software instantly flags the application as a critical title defect and suspects active malicious wire fraud. Because Desmond had initiated the loan using digital channels across state lines to fund an external escrow account, the bank's internal security protocols would automatically escalate the flagged file to a federal investigation. The bank would call the authorities to protect their own assets. The bank would pursue the charges. I would be completely removed from the equation. I would just be a citizen who happened to make a real estate transaction at a highly inconvenient time for the applicant. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the magnitude of what she was suggesting. The logic was flawless, but the execution required a massive personal sacrifice. To trigger that automated system, the property title had to change hands immediately. I had to sell the house. I had to sell the historic brownstone I had poured 3 years of my life into. I had to walk away from my custom crown molding my imported marble and the sanctuary I had built to protect myself from the world. It was the very foundation of my independence and the physical proof of my success. I looked around Loretta's quiet, peaceful dining room and weighed my options. I thought about the sheer audacity of Liam standing in my foyer, demanding my commercial warehouse keys. I thought about Chloe's weaponized tears and her complete refusal to participate in reality. I thought about Valerie screaming that it was my duty to finance their delusion. Most of all, I thought about Desmond digging out a 10-year-old medical document from when I was fighting for my life in an intensive care unit just to steal my equity. The brownstone was just bricks, mortar, and aesthetics. I could build another masterpiece. I could buy a dozen more properties. But my peace of mind was priceless. I realized in that moment that holding on to the physical house would forever tie me to their parasitic expectations. As long as I owned that brownstone, they would view it as a family asset waiting to be plundered. Selling the house was not a defeat. It was an amputation to save the rest of the body. I looked Aunt Loretta directly in the eyes and told her I understood exactly what needed to be done. I thanked her for her expertise and her unwavering clarity. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand firmly, and told me to be swift and leave absolutely no loose ends. She reminded me that predators only survive when their prey hesitates, and I was not prey. I gathered my files, stood up, and walked out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and turned off airplane mode. My phone immediately flooded with mundane, annoying texts from the family group chat. Valerie was complaining about the cost of groceries, and Liam was sending links to new cryptocurrency podcasts. I smiled at the glowing screen. They were so consumed by their own entitlement that they had no idea they were already dead in the water. I started the engine, shifted into drive, and prepared to execute the ghost move. I pulled into my driveway, parked in the garage, and stayed in the driver's seat for a full 10 minutes, staring at the blank screen of my phone. To pull off the ultimate ghost move, I had to be an active, visible participant in the illusion my family was building. If I went completely silent, Desmond's paranoia might flare up, prompting him to check the bank portal or push the underwriting process faster than the standard time frame. I needed him relaxed, arrogant, and entirely convinced of his own genius. I unlocked my phone and opened the family group chat. Chloe had just sent a picture of a ridiculously overpriced imported espresso machine to the thread. She captioned it with a message saying she absolutely could not wait to have this sitting on her new kitchen counters, tagging Liam with a string of heart emojis. The sheer unadulterated irony of her manifesting a luxury appliance for a house she was trying to purchase with my stolen equity was physically nauseating, but I did not let a fraction of that disgust seep into my response. I typed out a cheerful, supportive message. I told her the machine looked beautiful and that her new kitchen was going to be a dream. I added 3 smiling emojis and a sparkling star. I then sent a broader message to the group apologizing for my lack of communication over the past few days. I spun a lie that perfectly matched their exact expectations of me, feeding directly into their assumption that I was nothing more than a distracted workhorse. I told them I was absolutely swamped with a massive new commercial staging contract in the heart of Buckhead, working 18-hour days, and barely had time to breathe or check my personal emails. I even threw in a casual, highly calculated compliment directed at Liam. I mentioned that the recent market volatility he always talked about was making my commercial developers nervous, validating his empty cryptocurrency jargon and stroking his fragile ego. The response was immediate and sickeningly predictable. Valerie replied with a praying hands emoji, telling me to keep grinding because hard work always pays off for the family. Desmond sent a simple thumbs up, completely satisfied that his target was sufficiently distracted. Liam responded with a long, unsolicited voice note explaining basic macroeconomic principles to me, a woman who actually ran a highly profitable, tangible enterprise. I listened to the first 5 seconds of his condescending drawl, turned off the audio, and liked the message. They had swallowed the bait whole. They believed I was too buried in my own workload to notice the digital theft happening right under my nose. They were celebrating their impending victory. I stepped out of the car, walked into my brownstone, and turned my kitchen island into a war room. I could not list the property on the public multiple listing service. Desmond was actively engaged in real estate fraud using my identity. If he or his loan officer set up a basic internet alert for my address and saw a for sale sign pop up on a real estate website, the entire operation would instantly combust. I needed a completely invisible transaction. I needed the dark market. Operating in the upper echelons of Atlanta's luxury real estate staging sector meant my phone contacts were worth more than gold. I bypassed the standard agents and scrolled directly to the top of my list. I tapped the name of a private wealth broker who dealt exclusively with corporate relocations, international executives, and off-market acquisitions for ultra-high net worth individuals, demanding absolute discretion. I called him, and he answered on the second ring. I told him I was liquidating my primary residence immediately. I gave him the specifications, reminding him of the custom heart pine floors, the imported marble kitchen, the smart home integrations, and the historic architectural pedigree of the brownstone. Then I added the ultimate sweetener. I told the broker I was selling the property fully furnished. I was leaving the custom imported rugs, the bespoke lighting, the curated art collection, and the high-end luxury furniture exactly where it stood. I framed it as an exclusive turnkey opportunity. In reality, I was ensuring I did not leave a massive paper trail of moving trucks hauling a house full of inventory across the city, which might tip off the neighbors who inevitably talked to my parents. I gave him two non-negotiable conditions. The buyer had to pay in cash and the transaction had to close in exactly 4 days. Friday was my absolute deadline. The broker did not ask why I was running a fire sale on an architectural masterpiece. In his world, sudden liquidations usually meant a quiet divorce or a sudden corporate exile, and he was paid handsomely not to ask questions. He simply promised to make some calls to his international clients. I did not have to wait long. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the broker called back with a buyer profile that felt like divine intervention. An executive from a European luxury automotive brand was abruptly relocating his entire family to Atlanta to oversee a newly established North American headquarters. The executive was currently living out of a high-end hotel suite with his wife and two daughters, growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of the traditional housing market. They wanted a historic property. In a premium zip code, they demanded immediate occupancy, and they wanted it fully furnished to avoid the logistical nightmare of shipping their European estate across the Atlantic. The broker had shown them my private staging portfolio and the architectural photos of the brownstone. The executive's wife had fallen completely in love with the aesthetics. He informed me that they were willing to meet my exorbitant asking price without a single negotiation, and they were willing to cover all closing costs to expedite the paperwork. Because the funds were coming directly from a massive corporate relocation account, there would be no bank appraisals, no lending contingencies, and no tedious underwriting delays. It was a pure, unadulterated cash transaction. The broker confirmed that his legal team could have the title transfer documents drafted, vetted, and ready for signatures by Friday morning. I authorized the agreement digitally, my hand perfectly steady as I signed the preliminary brokerage contracts. The sheer velocity of the execution left a sharp metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. I stood up and walked through the halls of my beautiful home, running my fingers along the custom wainscoting and the sleek imported countertops. This house had been the physical manifestation of my resilience. It was the trophy I bought with my blood and sweat after climbing out of the mud of my family's financial chaos. But touching the walls now, I realized that true wealth is not anchored in brick and mortar. True wealth is mobility. True wealth is the ability to liquidate an asset to protect your peace, knowing you have the talent, the network, and the capital to build a bigger, better empire somewhere else. Desmond and Valerie believed my identity was tied to this house. They thought the brownstone was my weakness, the emotional leverage they could use to force me into a lifetime of financial servitude to Chloe and Liam. They failed to understand that the house was just a shell. I was the architect. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and began meticulously backing up my servers, wiping my local hard drives, and organizing the essential business files I needed to extract from the property. I had 96 hours to erase my physical footprint from the city of Atlanta. The digital trap was primed. The bait was in the water. I just had to keep smiling in the group chat while the clock ticked down to Friday. I had exactly 72 hours to become a ghost. Leaving a fully furnished multi-million-dollar brownstone is structurally simple, but logistically delicate. I could not simply hire a standard moving company and have a massive branded truck parked out front in broad daylight. Atlanta is a sprawling city, but high society circles are dangerously small, and Valerie had eyes everywhere. She thrived on neighborhood gossip, and it would only take one bored neighbor driving by to ruin the entire operation. If my parents caught wind that I was emptying my house, Desmond would instantly panic, flag the bank, and the automated fraud trigger I was counting on would be completely compromised. I needed an extraction, not a move. I contacted a boutique relocation firm that specialized in high-profile client transitions. They were the kind of discreet operation that moved professional athletes, targeted executives, and high-net-worth individuals in the dead of night, with non-disclosure agreements signed in blood. I paid a premium for their absolute silence. They arrived at 2 in the morning on Wednesday. There were no flashing lights, no loud backup sirens, and no branded vehicles. 3 sleek, unmarked black transit vans pulled silently into my rear alleyway, guided only by the ambient glow of the street lamps. The crew worked with military precision. Because the European executive was purchasing the property as a turnkey estate, keeping the custom velvet sofas, the imported chandeliers, and the curated art collection, I only needed to pack what carried my true identity. I stood in my massive walk-in closet and directed the crew as they carefully loaded my capsule wardrobe of tailored silk suits, my collection of vintage watches, and a heavy fireproof safe containing my most critical corporate documents and personal identification. I packed away the small sentimental items that were entirely mine objects, untainted by my family's toxic reach. As the movers silently hauled my garment bags down the back staircase, I walked through the brownstone one last time. The space was still beautiful, but the warmth was gone. I realized I was not just packing up clothes and documents, I was actively stripping away the suffocating expectations placed upon me since birth. For my entire life, Valerie and Desmond had conditioned me to believe that my success belonged to the collective. They constantly weaponized the concept of community and the strong black woman trope to justify their parasitism. They demanded that I act as the foundational pillar for their delusions, expecting me to stand strong and absorb the weight while Liam and Chloe danced on my shoulders. I watched the lead coordinator carry out my final box of financial ledgers. I did not shed a single tear for the brownstone. It had served its purpose. It had been my sanctuary, and now it was going to be the very weapon that dismantled my father's fraudulent scheme. I turned off the custom accent lights, armed the security system for the final time, and handed the master keys to the relocation coordinator. I climbed into the back of a private car service and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. My new residence was an absolute fortress. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse condo occupying the entire top floor of a newly constructed high-rise in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. Crucially, the lease did not bear the name Kiara Washington anywhere on the documentation. I executed the rental agreement and all utility transfers strictly under a newly formed anonymous subsidiary of my staging limited liability company. To the public record, to the post office, and most importantly to Desmond and Valerie, my residential footprint was entirely invisible. I had vanished from the grid. The security infrastructure of the building was flawless. The private parking garage required biometric facial scans for entry. The 24-hour concierge desk operated with strict, uncompromising protocols requiring digital pre-authorization for every single guest. Best of all, my unit featured a private keyed elevator that opened directly into my personal foyer. If my family ever managed to somehow discover the address, which was statistically impossible given the corporate shielding, they could never physically reach my front door. They could not ambush me. They could not show up with suitcases and tears. They could not demand entry. I stepped out of the private elevator and into my new sanctuary. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around the entire living space, offering a sweeping, unobstructed view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. The floors were polished concrete, the kitchen featured sleek matte black cabinetry, and the sheer scale of the open concept layout felt like breathing pure oxygen. It matched the cold, pristine clarity in my mind perfectly. There was no clutter, no history, and absolutely no room for uninvited guests. Standing on the expansive glass balcony looking out over the city lights, the psychological shift finally cemented itself in my chest. For 35 years, I had played the role of the dutiful daughter. I had accepted the microaggressions, the financial demands, and the blatant disrespect because a small ingrained part of me believed that outworking their toxicity would eventually earn their genuine love. I thought that if I just became successful enough, generous enough, and accommodating enough, they would finally look at me with the same reverence they blindly offered to a mediocre white man who brought nothing but debt to our family. I buried that version of Kiara right there on the 42nd floor. She was dead. The woman who stood in her place was a ruthless protector of her own peace. I finally understood that you cannot negotiate with emotional terrorists, and you cannot buy the respect of people who view you as an ATM. Desmond and Valerie did not love me. They loved what my credit score and my work ethic could provide for Chloe. By initiating that fraudulent home equity line of credit, my father had not just crossed a legal line, he had severed the very last thread of my familial obligation. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of liberation. I was no longer their safety net. I was an electrified fence. Desmond thought he was hunting a reliable workhorse, completely unaware that the pasture was empty and the trap was set. He was banking his entire future on my predictable compliance, and I was about to deliver a level of chaos he could not even begin to comprehend. I poured a glass of sparkling water, set my phone on the sleek marble kitchen island, and listened to the absolute silence of my new home. I did not check the family group chat. I did not care what lies Valerie was currently spinning or what overpriced appliances Chloe was dreaming of buying with my stolen equity. I walked into my new master suite, climbed into my bed, and went to sleep with a clear conscience. I slept soundly, deeply, and without a single nightmare. Friday was coming, the cash buyer was ready, and the automated banking systems were perfectly primed to catch a thief. Friday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity of a freshly balanced spreadsheet. I sat at the polished mahogany conference table in the downtown offices of my private wealth broker. Across from me sat the legal representatives for the European executive, their tailored suits rustling as they shuffled through thick stacks of premium watermarked paper. There was no emotional fanfare in this room. There were no sentimental pauses or moments of hesitation. This was a high-level corporate relocation transaction executed with the brutal efficiency I thrived on. I picked up the heavy brass pen provided by the closing attorney and prepared to sign my name. I was signing away the custom heart pine floors, the imported marble countertops, and the sanctuary I had built from the absolute ground up. I was signing away the physical address that my father was currently attempting to leverage into $250,000 of fraudulent debt. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I brought the pen to the paper and signed the deed transfer. With those swift, deliberate strokes, the legal ownership of the Buckhead brownstone officially shifted. The broker checked his encrypted tablet, verified the secure digital pathways, and nodded to the room. The wire transfer had been initiated. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my tailored blazer pocket. It was an automated alert from my primary commercial bank. The cash had successfully landed in my heavily shielded corporate holding account. The brownstone was officially gone. It was no longer my asset. More importantly, it was no longer Desmond's collateral. I shook hands with the legal team, walked out of the high-rise office building, and stepped into the bustling Atlanta sunlight. The air felt incredibly light in my lungs. I knew exactly what was happening in the digital ether at that very second. The moment that deed transfer was recorded with the county clerk, the automated underwriting software at Desmond's regional bank received a critical, unavoidable update. The digital monitor placed on my former title registered a catastrophic defect. The system saw that the property Desmond was attempting to borrow against no longer belonged to the name on the application. The banking algorithms did not care about family legacy, respectability, politics, or black love. They only cared about extreme risk mitigation. The hard stop was triggered instantly. The application was frozen in its tracks, and the file was automatically red flagged for the bank's internal fraud investigation unit. The trap was not just set. The steel jaws had snapped shut. Desmond and Liam were caught. They just did not know it yet. I spent Friday night in my new penthouse drinking a glass of vintage sparkling water and watching the city lights flicker below my floor-to-ceiling windows. I slept with the deep, uninterrupted peace of a woman who had successfully fireproofed her entire life. When Saturday morning arrived, I took my time. I brewed a fresh espresso, rolled out my yoga mat on the polished concrete floor, and let the morning sun warm my skin. I did not have a single worry about what my parents were doing. I was entirely detached from their chaos. At precisely 10 o'clock, the serenity of my morning was punctured by the shrill chime of my phone. It was a notification from the toxic family group chat. I picked up the device and read the new message from Chloe. It was dripping with the kind of smug, unearned arrogance she had perfected over 28 years. She wrote that Mom was hosting a mandatory special family dinner on Sunday evening. She added a heavily passive-aggressive command, telling me not to be late because they had massive family news to share. She decorated the text with a string of popping champagne bottles and little suburban house emojis. I stared at the screen and let out a sharp, cold laugh. Their predictability was almost insulting to my intelligence. I knew exactly what that text meant. Desmond had undoubtedly checked his online banking portal that morning and seen that the home equity line of credit had moved from processing to the final pending status. In his financially illiterate mind, pending meant the money was practically in his pocket. He assumed the bank was just ticking minor administrative boxes before wiring the $250,000 to the suburban title company. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed he had successfully stolen my equity to buy Chloe and Liam their brand new suburban estate. The Sunday dinner was entirely a staged ambush. Valerie and Desmond were planning to sit me down, feed me an overpriced steak, and drop the news that Chloe and Liam were moving into their new home. They were going to spin it as a massive triumph for Liam's business acumen. They expected me to sit there, smile, and applaud the mediocre man who had just tried to commandeer my warehouse. They assumed I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one paying for his new house. They thought that by the time I eventually discovered the fraudulent loan tied to my name, the cash would be gone and I would be too paralyzed by the fear of ruining the family to report them to the authorities. They viewed me as a hostage who did not even know she had been kidnapped. They wanted a captive audience for their grand fraudulent victory lap. They wanted to look me in the eyes while they spent my stolen money. They wanted to force me to swallow the ultimate disrespect and smile while doing it. I walked over to my expansive closet and began pulling out my wardrobe for Sunday evening. I bypassed the soft, accommodating colors I used to wear to keep the peace at family gatherings. I selected a tailored, razor-sharp emerald green blazer and matching trousers. It was the armor of a woman going to a professional execution. I picked up my phone, opened the group chat, and typed my response. I did not ask any questions about the big news. I did not show a single ounce of irritation regarding the mandatory tone of the invitation. I matched Chloe's artificial enthusiasm with absolute chilling precision. I typed, "I would not miss it for the world." I hit send, tossed the phone onto the plush duvet, and spent the rest of my Saturday enjoying the quiet, untouchable safety of my penthouse. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and the curtain was about to rise on the most devastating dinner my family would ever host. The restaurant was an exclusive, dimly lit steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead, the kind of establishment that required a reservation months in advance. I walked into the private dining room wearing my tailored emerald green suit, my posture perfect, my expression completely unreadable. Valerie had gone all out for this staged victory lap. She was wearing a brand new silk dress, her hair freshly styled, and she was already sipping a premium vintage red wine when I arrived. Desmond sat at the head of the table, projecting the false, inflated confidence of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the banking system. Liam and Chloe sat across from me, whispering to each other and giggling like children who had just pulled off a successful heist. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu. There were bone-in ribeyes, truffle macaroni, imported lobster tails, and towering plates of oysters. Desmond loudly proclaimed that he was paying for the entire meal to celebrate a massive turning point for the family. I knew he was paying with a credit card that was already maxed out, operating under the delusion that my stolen $250,000 would wipe his slate clean by Monday morning. I ordered a simple salad and a glass of sparkling water. I watched them eat. I watched them perform their wealth. I watched them eagerly celebrate my financial execution. As the waiters cleared the heavy ceramic dinner plates and poured fresh coffee, the atmosphere in the private room shifted. Valerie gave Chloe a subtle, encouraging nod. This was the moment they had rehearsed. This was the ambush. Chloe picked up a silver spoon and clinked it against her crystal water glass. She stood up slightly, leaning her weight against Liam's shoulder to present a united front. She flashed that smug, entitled smile that had defined her entire existence. She cleared her throat and loudly announced to the table that she and Liam had wonderful news. She looked me dead in the eye and stated that Mom and Dad had promised they could move into my fully paid-off Buckhead brownstone. She declared that it was finally time for me to share my blessings with the family and that they would be taking over my master suite by the end of the month while Liam utilized my warehouse for his business. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply lifted my glass of sparkling water, took a slow, deliberate sip, set the glass down delicately on the pristine white tablecloth, and replied, "That is awkward. I sold the house last Friday to a beautiful couple." The entire table froze in absolute deafening silence. The ambient jazz music playing through the restaurant speakers suddenly felt incredibly loud. Valerie turned completely ashen. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. Her heavy silver dessert fork slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering sharply against her fine china plate. Chloe's smug smile collapsed into an expression of sheer, uncomprehending stupidity. Liam blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the sudden structural collapse of his free ride. But Desmond was the one who broke. Desmond was a man who relied entirely on the illusion of control, and I had just detonated a bomb underneath his foundation. His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The polished, respectable patriarch vanished, replaced by a panicked, desperate fraudster, cornered by his own hubris. He slammed his heavy fist down on the table, rattling the crystal glasses and sloshing red wine onto the white linen. "You cannot sell that house!" Desmond roared, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "You have no right. We have a pending application." The moment the words left his mouth, the remaining oxygen vanished from the room. Valerie gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. She knew instantly that Desmond had just confessed. He had been so blinded by panic that he accidentally screamed his guilt out loud in a public restaurant. I did not flinch. I did not recoil from his anger. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and looked at my father with the cold, sterile gaze of an auditor examining a corrupted ledger. "A pending application," I repeated, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You mean the $250,000 home equity line of credit you initiated using my name, my tax identification number, and a revoked power of attorney from when I was in a medical coma 10 years ago?" Desmond's jaw dropped. The purple flush on his face vanished, replaced by a sickly, terrifying gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I reached inside my emerald green blazer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I did not rush. I took my time undoing the clasp. I pulled out the stack of documents I had secured from my private wealth broker and my title contact. I slid the pristine, heavily watermarked papers across the center of the tablecloth, stopping them right in front of Desmond's empty dessert plate. The top document was the wire transfer receipt confirming a massive multi-million-dollar cash deposit into my corporate holding account. Beneath it was the legally binding county-recorded title transfer document bearing the signatures of the European executive and his wife. I told Desmond to look very closely at the dates. I stated that the title of the Buckhead brownstone legally transferred out of my name at exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I explained the mechanics of the banking software to him using the exact terminology Aunt Loretta had provided. I detailed how the regional bank's automated underwriting system places a continuous digital monitor on the property title during the final approval phase. I watched his eyes widen in raw horror as I explained that when the deed changed hands on Friday, his fraudulent loan application triggered a catastrophic title defect. Valerie began to shake. She reached out and grabbed Desmond's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. She tried to whisper to him to stay quiet, realizing that every word spoken was digging their legal grave deeper. But Desmond was paralyzed, staring at the title transfer document as if it were a death warrant. I turned my gaze away from my hyperventilating father and locked eyes with Liam. Liam was sitting completely frozen, gripping the edge of the table as the reality of his impending criminal liability set in. He thought he was marrying into a gullible, wealthy family that would blindly finance his delusions. He had eagerly participated in plotting his grand suburban future, completely unaware that he had just walked directly into a federal snare. I kept my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face. I told Liam that the escrow account at the Suburban Title Company, the one set up to receive the stolen $250,000 to purchase his new 4-bedroom modern farmhouse, was currently completely empty. I told him the builder would be canceling their contract by tomorrow morning because the wire transfer they were expecting was never going to arrive. Chloe burst into sudden theatrical tears, completely ignoring the severity of the legal crimes her parents had just committed. She slammed her hands on the table and demanded to know where she and Liam were supposed to live, screaming that they had already forwarded their mail to the new suburban address. She looked at me with pure venom and accused me of ruining her entire life. I ignored her tantrum entirely. I kept my focus strictly on her husband. "You tried to commit mortgage fraud on my property," I said, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. "Unfortunately for you, you cannot borrow against a house I no longer own." The silence in the private dining room was so absolute it felt like a vacuum. Desmond stared at the documents I had slid across the table, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. Liam was practically vibrating with panic, his eyes darting toward the exit, as if calculating whether he could physically outrun a federal indictment. Before Valerie could formulate another defense or launch into a fresh wave of manipulation, the sharp, intrusive trill of a cell phone shattered the quiet. It was Desmond's phone sitting face up next to his untouched bone and ribeye steak. The caller ID displayed the name of the regional bank. It was not the standard customer service number. It was the direct unlisted line for the Internal Security and Fraud Division. Desmond stared at the glowing screen like it was a live grenade. He did not reach for it. He knew exactly what that phone call meant. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms, and told him to answer it. I suggested that ignoring a call from a federal fraud investigator usually made them highly suspicious and prone to escalating their timeline. With a trembling, sweaty hand, Desmond picked up the device and pressed the green button, holding it to his ear. He managed a weak, raspy greeting. Because the room was so quiet, I could hear the crisp, professional voice of the bank representative leaking through the earpiece. The investigator informed Desmond that his pending home equity line of credit had been permanently suspended. The voice stated that a critical title defect had triggered an automated hard stop. Because the digital initiation of the funds crossed state lines and involved a third-party escrow account, the file had been escalated to their legal compliance department for suspected wire fraud. The investigator then asked Desmond to verify his identity and explain the severe discrepancies regarding the revoked power of attorney document uploaded to their portal. Desmond immediately ended the call. He did not say goodbye. He just dropped the phone back onto the table as if it had physically burned his skin. The reality of the situation finally breached the fortress of his denial. He was a 60-year-old man facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. While Desmond was hyperventilating, Chloe remained entirely trapped in her own narcissistic bubble. She did not comprehend the legal severity of what had just happened. She did not care that her father was about to be investigated by federal authorities and lose everything. She only cared about her immediate comfort and her fragile social standing. Chloe slammed her hands on the table, knocking over a crystal water glass that shattered onto the floor. She burst into violent theatrical hysterics, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. She screamed at Desmond, demanding to know what he was going to do about her new house. She cried that she had already told all her friends about the 4-bedroom modern farmhouse, and she had ordered custom living room furniture that was scheduled for delivery next week. She looked at Liam for support, but Liam was busy staring at the door. He turned to Desmond and angrily asked how he could be so stupid as to get caught. Liam actually had the audacity to play the victim, claiming that his pristine business reputation would be ruined by associating with a fraudulent transaction. He completely ignored the fact that he was the sole intended beneficiary of the stolen money. Chloe turned her fury toward me. She shrieked that I had intentionally destroyed her marriage and her future. She demanded to know where she and Liam were supposed to live now that they had been evicted and their new suburban estate was gone. I looked at her, thrashing and weeping over the loss of stolen goods. I calmly suggested she look into extended stay motels on the outskirts of the city, as they rarely required credit checks or proof of steady income. Valerie finally snapped out of her shock. The matriarch, who had spent the last 35 years prioritizing her image over my well-being, suddenly realized that her entire social standing was about to be obliterated. When the community found out her husband was a federal criminal, she would be permanently exiled from her church, her social clubs, and her neighborhood. She looked down at the wire transfer receipt sitting on the table, the one proving I had just deposited millions of dollars in cash from the sale of my brownstone. Her demeanor shifted from commanding and arrogant to utterly desperate. She reached across the table, her hands grasping at the empty air toward me. She dropped her voice into a frantic, pleading register. She told me that we were family, and that Black families have to protect each other from the justice system. She begged me to use the cash from the sale of the house to hire the best criminal defense attorneys in Atlanta for Desmond. She pleaded with me to pay off the regional bank, to negotiate a private settlement, to do whatever it took to make the federal investigation disappear. She actually believed that after they had plotted to steal $250,000 from my equity, I would willingly hand over millions in legitimate cash to save them from the consequences of their own felony. She told me that if Desmond went to prison, the stress and public humiliation would kill her. She weaponized her maternal status one last time, crying that a good daughter would never let her parents face financial and legal ruin. I stood up smoothly from my chair. I did not rush. I smoothed out the front of my emerald green trousers and reached for my tailored coat resting on the back of the chair. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and adjusted my collar. I looked down at the 4 people sitting around the ruined dinner table. I told Valerie that a good daughter protects her peace from people who view her as prey. I stated that they had made a calculated, malicious choice. They chose to fund a mediocre man's fragile ego over their own daughter's livelihood. They looked at the business I built from nothing, the home I restored with my own hands, and the security I earned, and they decided they were entitled to strip it all away, just to maintain the illusion of Liam's success and Chloe's perfection. I looked Desmond dead in the eye and told him that his arrogance had finally written a check his reputation could not cash. I said that I would not spend a single cent of my hard-earned wealth to finance a legal defense for a man who tried to forge my name and leverage my medical trauma. I told them that the federal government was incredibly thorough, and they should go home and prepare for a very long, very painful audit of their entire lives. I picked up my clutch and stepped away from the table. Valerie was openly sobbing now, her face buried in her hands. Desmond was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken and visibly shaking. Liam and Chloe were arguing viciously with each other, the illusion of their perfect marriage shattering instantly under the weight of impending poverty and criminal association. I stopped at the door of the private dining room. I looked back at the sprawling feast they had ordered to celebrate my financial execution. The imported lobsters, the Wagyu steaks, the truffle sides, and the vintage wine they had eagerly consumed on credit. I reminded Desmond that he had loudly claimed he was hosting this dinner to celebrate a massive turning point for the family. I told him to enjoy the meal because it was likely the last luxury dinner he would have for a very long time. I turned the brass handle of the door, opened it, and stepped out into the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the restaurant. I did not look back. I walked past the host stand out the front doors and stepped into the cool night air, leaving them sitting there with their ruined lives, their federal investigation, and an astronomical restaurant bill they had absolutely no way to pay. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that private dining room, leaving my family to choke on their own arrogance and a restaurant bill they could not afford. Time moves remarkably fast when you are no longer dragging dead weight. I am sitting in the home office of my midtown penthouse, watching the morning sun reflect off the glass skyscrapers surrounding me. The cash from the sale of my brownstone did not just secure my escape. It became the capital that launched my staging firm into the international market. I recently finalized a massive corporate contract to design and stage a portfolio of luxury expatriate residences in London and Dubai. My business has doubled in revenue, My team has expanded, and my days are filled with high-level negotiations that challenge and fulfill me. My residential footprint remains entirely anonymous, protected by a fortress of corporate LLCs and non-disclosure agreements. I have built an empire in the sky, and the air up here is incredibly clean. I do not check my blocked messages, and I do not seek out updates on the people who tried to ruin me. When you operate at a certain level in Atlanta, the news simply finds you through the public record and the whisper network. The federal justice system operates with a slow grinding and utterly merciless precision. The automated fraud trigger I initiated by selling my house worked exactly as Aunt Loretta predicted. Desmond and Liam are currently drowning in a tidal wave of federal indictments. The regional bank handed all the forged documents, the unauthorized power of attorney, and the digital footprints directly over to federal investigators. There is no honor among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty between a desperate father and an entitled son-in-law. The moment the federal agents started applying pressure, Desmond and Liam immediately turned on each other. Liam tried to play the role of the innocent, oblivious victim, claiming Desmond had orchestrated the entire home equity line of credit without his knowledge. But federal prosecutors follow the money. They traced the intended wire transfer directly to the suburban title company for a house listed squarely under Liam's name. Desmond, realizing that Liam was trying to throw him to the wolves, retaliated by handing over every text message and email, proving Liam was a willing and eager co-conspirator. They are now locked in a brutal legal battle, fighting the government and each other. Desmond had to liquidate every remaining cent of his retirement savings just to afford a criminal defense attorney who would even take his case. He is facing multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. He is a broken man stripped of the patriarchal authority he used to terrorize his own household. Liam is similarly buried under a mountain of legal debt, his fraudulent digital consulting agency permanently shuttered by the scrutiny of the investigation. The financial collapse annihilated the illusion of Chloe and Liam's grand romance. You cannot sustain a marriage built on a foundation of unearned luxury when the funding is abruptly cut off. Without my bank accounts to act as a safety net, their lifestyle evaporated overnight. They were officially evicted from the luxury apartment, and with their credit scores completely destroyed by the fraud investigation, no reputable landlord in the city would approve their rental applications. Chloe's fairy tale wedding ended in an extended stay motel on the outskirts of the city. I heard through the grapevine that she spends her days in a cramped, carpeted room, furious that Liam cannot provide the life he promised. She blames him for his incompetence, and he blames her for her family's failure to secure the bag. The toxic dynamic they tried to force onto me is now the prison they share. Valerie received a punishment far worse than any legal indictment. She received absolute social death. In the image-obsessed, respectability-driven circles she worshipped, reputation is the only currency that matters. When the federal investigation became public knowledge, her carefully curated facade disintegrated. The church community she relied on to validate her superiority, quietly but swiftly, ostracized her. She was removed from her committees, and her wealthy friends stopped returning her calls. She is a pariah, completely isolated in a suburban house she can barely afford to maintain now that Desmond's income is gone. The silent treatment she once weaponized against me is now her permanent reality. She is alone with the consequences of her vanity, stripped of the daughter she abused and the social standing she prized above all else. I do not gloat over their misery. I do not feel joy at their destruction. I feel an absolute clinical detachment. They wrote their own tragic ending the moment they decided my livelihood was acceptable collateral damage for their delusions. The sun is beginning to set over Atlanta, painting the sky in deep streaks of violet and burnt orange. I step out of my home office and walk out onto the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse. Aunt Loretta is standing near the railing holding a crystal glass of imported white wine. She comes to visit me often now. She is the only family member who has the security clearance to access my private elevator. I hand her a small plate of artisan cheeses and lean against the cool glass barrier, looking out at the glittering grid of city lights below us. Loretta takes a sip of her wine, looking at me with a quiet, profound respect. She tells me that she always knew I had the steel required to survive our family, but she never imagined I would execute my exit with such flawless precision. She says that watching Desmond finally face the ledger he has been running from his entire life is the closest thing to poetic justice she has ever witnessed. I look out over the sprawling city, feeling the gentle evening breeze against my face. I tell Loretta that for 35 years I thought it was my responsibility to heal the sick roots of our family tree. I thought that if I provided enough water, enough sunlight, and enough financial support, the tree would eventually bear healthy fruit. I tell her that I finally understand the harsh reality of nature. When the roots are entirely toxic, watering them only spreads the poison faster. The only way to allow the tree to grow is to take an axe to the rot and sever the connection completely. I had to cut them off to save myself. I amputated the expectation that I would ever be loved for who I am rather than what I can provide. In doing so, I preserved my business, my assets, and my spirit. Loretta nods slowly, the city lights reflecting in her sharp, intelligent eyes. She tells me that I did not just save myself. I broke a generational curse. She clinks her crystal glass against mine, a quiet, resonant sound of victory in the evening air. I stand on my balcony, a self-made Black woman completely untethered from guilt manipulation and parasitic demands. I am surrounded by the silence of a home that is entirely my own. There are no surprise visits, no financial ambushes, and no fraudulent signatures waiting in the shadows. I have established impenetrable boundaries, and behind those walls I have built an extraordinary life. I am at absolute peace, and I am unapologetically successful. The most profound lesson from Kiara's journey is that shared DNA does not excuse toxic entitlement or financial abuse. For years, she believed that providing relentless support would eventually earn her family's genuine love. However, she discovered that when roots are entirely toxic, watering them only spreads the poison. True liberation comes from setting impenetrable boundaries and understanding that you are not obligated to be a sacrificial lamb for someone else's delusion. Protecting your peace, your assets, and your mental health is not selfish. It is an absolute necessity. Sometimes walking away is the ultimate act of self-love. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace and your future from toxic family members? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys of breaking generational curses.